Hey guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I'm excited to have a very special guest, Daniel Plotkin. Daniel is currently working towards his PhD in molecular and applied muscle physiology, and he's deeply passionate about everything muscle growth, fat loss, and health science. He's someone who combines high-level science with practical application, which is why I think you're going to want to listen to this and get a ton of value from our conversation. Today, we're breaking down some of the most frequently debated aspects of hypertrophy training. We start by exploring the popular 5 to 30 rep range for muscle growth, where Daniel shares his insights on why this range is often recommended and what might happen if we go outside of it. We also discuss whether he has a go-to rep range when programming for hypertrophy and why that choice matters. We'll then get into an equally crucial topic, rest periods. Daniel shares his thoughts on how different exercises might need different rest lengths and whether shorter rests with extra sets can really match up to longer rests. He'll also give us some practical advice on how to time rest periods for maximum growth, and we'll discuss if there's ever a risk of resting too long. Finally, Daniel will introduce us to the PEEL method, a valuable approach to making science-based decisions in your training. This method is very helpful to understand and apply science in a way that's going to help you personally, which I think is really incredible. And guys, if you do enjoy these sort of discussions, make sure to like, subscribe, do share it with anyone you think might be interested. Tag myself and Daniel over on Instagram. It's always helpful, or whatever social media platform that you're on, so we can say thank you and also people can get eyes on it. And if you aren't subscribed, if I hadn't said that already, do make sure to subscribe. I'm going to remind you again. Leave a comment if you're over on YouTube. Give us a thumbs up. Give us a 5-star rating on Spotify if you can, or whatever podcast platform if you can review. It'd be highly appreciated. But without further ado, let's get right into it. Here's my conversation with Daniel Plotkin. Is it Dan or is it Daniel?
Either one is good. Actually, half the people who I know call me Dan, half call me, well, I guess not half, a third call me Plotkin, a third call me Dan, and a third call me Daniel. So it's all good. Yeah, my last name gets a lot of love just because Daniel is the most common name ever. So
True.
I don't care either way. Whichever one rolls off the tongue better for you.
Yeah, it's funny. I was always Steven, and my family all call me that. But when I started playing sports, it was Steve. I got Steve sometimes, which I'm not a huge fan of.
That's weird, actually.
Yeah, few people call
like
me
a disease.
That. Yeah. And then I decided, hey, so many people know me by Steve that I'm just going to change like my social media. It's all Steve Hall. And then everyone basically, I'm like 90% Steve, and then just my family are Steven. Or if someone doesn't know me, sometimes they call me Steven, and then my partner will call me Steven if she's like annoyed with me.
Yeah, I definitely didn't. So I say a third, but my family actually calls me by a few different names just because my background's Russian. So there's the Russian way to say Daniel. So Danyuk is what a lot of my family calls me. And then my mom actually the head of the lab calls me Danny. And so just a few people call me Danny. So everything goes free for all. You can even use the Russian version if you want.
I like Danny, but I'm probably going to forget it. I'll end up just going with Dan because it's the easiest one for my simple brain to kind of comprehend. Although I like Plotkin. That's a nice one. I think that it's a good, like, some people have good last names for nicknames. Some people don't. I don't think calling me Hall is a bit like, it's an actual thing as well. Like a Hall is a thing.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I feel like that messes things up if it's an actual thing. It has an association already. You're not sure if the person's calling you or just saying the word, so on. So yeah,
exactly. But so names aside, we're going to be talking about some interesting topics today, and I think many of them kind of approaching them slightly differently to where I think people would expect us to go. So the first kind of topic I wanted to go into was kind of understanding hypertrophy rep ranges. I think the majority of listeners, when they hear hypertrophy rep ranges, they'll think 5 to 30. The evidence is pretty clear. We can grow within that range if we're matching sets, RAR, that sort of thing, it seems pretty equivalent growth that we can tend to get, at least from the research and the length of time the research has been done, which I think some people forget. That sometimes, like, hey, that's a limitation in its own right. But you dug into this a little bit more in terms of, can we actually grow from plus 30? Is less than 5 really that bad for growth? Like, I'm sure there's people listening, they're like, if they get less than 5 reps, they're like, man, that was a wasted set. Or if they find themselves creeping up above 30, they're like, oh no, like now it's all endurance characteristics from here. So I'd love to get your perspectives on this, and maybe then we can dig into like what the optimal rep range might be for hypertrophy in your eyes.
Yeah, so I think often when I approach this topic, it's more to calm people down than it is to give them a direct prescription on what is the best. So oftentimes, like, oh, why do we care about super low and why do we care about super high when we're probably going to stay in the middle for the most part if we're just being honest with ourselves in terms of what, even if you just put everything aside, what feels good. But I think it's important to explore them for a couple of reasons. One is that at the high end, there's certain injuries and there's just people who are equipment limited. So let's say, 14-year-old Daniel is just doing push-ups at home. You get pretty dang good at push-ups. You're worried that, that 50 rep set of push-ups is not giving you the most bang for your buck and so on. So just from that standpoint, I think it's useful to just explore the topic while also sort of getting some insights into physiology. When can you get too high and why? And on the other side of the coin, when can you get too low? So which do you want to start with? Too high or too low?
You talked about the 50 press ups, which is impressive if you're up there at 15, if you were. But yeah, let's go high and then let's go low.
Yeah. So with high, I think people are surprised by just how high you can go and still gain similar hypertrophy, anywhere in the 40, 35 range. It's pretty clear that that gives you similar amounts of gains to, say, something like 5 to 15. There's been lots of studies comparing that sort of 30% 1RM to 70% 1RM. But then when you climb up higher than that, so around 20% of 1RM and lower, that's when you start seeing some evidence, pretty weak evidence, if we're being honest, just a few studies, and some of the studies have some limitations. But the strongest study design on this front, I believe, is Lasavicius 2018. So they equated volume load. So it ended up being a different amount of sets per week. But even in the case of slightly less sets per week, the group, or technically the leg or the side that was doing everything but 20% 1RM actually grew about double the 20% 1RM arm or leg. So the way they did it is one side of the body in 3 groups was always doing 20% 1RM. So 3 groups, every group is doing one side 20% 1RM. And then the other side of those 3 groups was doing either 40, 60, or 80% 1RM. So it was a within between subject design. And regardless of the fact that some ended up doing 4 sets per session, some ended up doing slightly less than 3 sets per session, the side that was doing the 20% 1RM was always doing 3 sets per session. And regardless of that slight difference in sets, every condition every condition, the 40, 60, and 80 grew about double the 20% condition. So it seems like at that low end, there is a downside to just cranking out those reps, getting up to, I believe the average was about 62 to 65 or so for the 20% limb. So I'd say safely cap the amount of sets you're doing at 50, even if you want to go crazy in terms of you're really trying to both maximize, let's say, muscular endurance and hypertrophy at the same time, and you're trying to be on the super safe side, then probably don't go much above 50. And then the other 2 studies are studies that it's a bit harder to unpack because they were BFR studies. So blood flow restriction studies, where they also did a within subject design, a within between subject design, where it was even lower. It was 15% 1RM, and they had a non-BFR condition, so a 15% condition and a 70% condition. And this is two studies, both from the same lab. I think it was Jeremy Lineke's lab. And there's two slight limitations to these studies. It was Jesse and Buckner, two studies that were done, I think, within a year. And one, the reps were capped at 90. So even if you didn't fail at 90, they stopped your set. And the thought was that would become endurance and so on. But the issue is that that's a limitation because they could have been significantly far from failure. But if you look at the rep data, 3 individuals, I want to say, went all the way up to 90 for all 4 sets of leg extensions. So that means that they were doing a bunch of early sets earlier in the 8-week program that were getting stopped short of failure. So that's one thing to consider. And the second thing to consider is that the time between sets was slightly lower. So it was in the 70% condition, it was, I want to say, 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes. And in the very low load condition, it was 30 seconds. So 2 limitations there where it's slightly less rest between sets, but also the fact, and probably more importantly, the fact that many sets were probably stopped short of failure because of the fact that they were stopped at that 90 mark. But I think one thing to really underline there is that 15% is getting you to a lot of sets that are over 90, and ain't nobody want to do that just from a practical standpoint, a pain standpoint, and a time standpoint. Honestly, it starts running into, like, this is a absurdly long set too. So that's just an interesting, I think, physiological question. Can we get to those motor units even at that light of a load? But practically speaking, I don't think anybody wants to go crazy on that side of the spectrum. So I think those 3 studies together, 1 strongly and 2 weakly, point toward the fact that you can go too light, but it ends up being a lot lighter than a lot of people think.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think about, just as a wild example, I guess, people, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, Dan, but I see some people who have like just huge calves. They don't train their calves. They don't train at all, but they have big calves. And I walk behind them and they're like springing off their calf. They're not like walking like a normal person would walk, as far as I'm concerned. Like if I tried to walk like them, I'd be like, this feels really weird. And so they're kind of walking on their tippy toes. And I guess, I mean, that's low load, right? But if they're doing enough of it, and I don't know, yeah, I mean, they're doing enough of it and they're getting enough mechanical tension, close enough to failure or whatever it is. Maybe they're getting a bit of a pump in their calves. Then that could be like a way to grow. Or I don't know, you see people with big forearms and maybe they're a builder and they're always like doing very low load, but high repetition, like work with tools. It kind of, anecdotally, I'm just thinking you see this sometimes.
Yeah, I think it's probably a combination of a proclivity to gains. So they obviously are probably genetically gifted. And also the fact that people sort of think of activities as binary, like this is high intensity and this is low intensity, but similar to sort of like a marathon where you have some hills where you're going to use that creatine phosphate system or a high intensity system. It would be like the example you gave, like a builder. Most of the time they're doing stuff that they can do for a while, but other times they actually have to push it and it's more like a 10 RM or something like that. So I think people sometimes binarize things when it could actually be a pretty decent stimulus if not for just 20 seconds or so.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you in terms of practicality. Even going much above 20 repetitions is like just mentally it can be hard to engage for such a long set. And I think that's elucidated also within the literature on like reps in reserve and how accurate people are. People tend to be less accurate as you're going up in high reps because I guess people just, there's multiple reasons you could switch off. The burn, the fatigue, that's part of it too. Like it's a bit more uncomfortable in that way. So I think practically, like you said, not going above 50 makes sense. But the cool thing is, it's, again, people think about it with, I think there was a time where people like, I must have 20 grams of high quality protein to meet the leucine threshold to grow. If I have a meal with anything less than 20, there's no growth. It's like, well, no, you just haven't maximized that growth. It's like, hey, even if you go above 50 reps, there could still be some growth there. And I guess within that kind of relates to some of the newbies where they're cycling and they're growing just from like as easy as just cycling, which is obviously multiple reps away from failure and probably very high reps just in general when you think about it.
Yeah, for sure. So I think, yeah, just giving people a conceptual understanding of not worrying about it, I think
Yeah.
is a sort of a useful tool. But yeah, I totally agree that for the vast majority of people, one, it would be more comfortable, but two, there is literature pointing toward the fact that depending on, so it gets a little bit more nuanced depending on the machine, depending on the exercise and so on, proximity to failure, just understanding how close you are to failure or estimating that will change. But I think it's safe to say that somewhere around 15, it gets at least slightly worse compared to like a 5 to 12 type deal.
You said 15. Did you mean 50?
No, 15 in terms of being able to gauge proximity
Oh,
to
sorry.
failure. So
Got you.
understanding RIR. Yeah, yeah.
Sorry. That makes sense. Yeah, completely.
Mhm.
And yeah, it's something I often will talk through clients where we'll have like a rep range. And I'm like, the rep range is far less important than your kind of proximity to failure. Like, don't stop at 20 reps if you're still like 6, 7, 8 reps in reserve. Like, I want you to push to that fatigue point because that seems to be the thing that matters more than anything. Is that kind of where you stand with this, where people shouldn't just like stop? They should make sure they're getting to that proximity to failure.
Yeah, so that'll be the biggest thing by far. And then I like the fact that there's a little bit of leeway also just in terms of sensation. So certain exercises just seem to lend themselves better to slightly higher rep ranges. So for example, for me and a lot of clients, overhead tricep, if I try to do fives on like a cable overhead tricep, like my elbow doesn't feel great. Certain people can get away with it. You see them post on Instagram really confidently. You can do fives on anything. You can personally do fives on anything. I can't. Many of the people who I've trained can't. So having the leeway to do something like a 15 on an overhead tricep, or even I do the behind the back lateral raises, and it just doesn't really feel right at like really heavy loads. It's almost like I get like an initial pain sensation and then it starts feeling okay. But if I lower the load, it feels like really smooth and I can still get the same stimulus. I'm definitely going for that higher rep range. So just giving people that leeway where I'm probably never going to go above 20 or so. Never say never, but for the most part, I don't go above 20. But having that wide enough range and knowing even if I program something like a 15 to 20 and I end up for whatever reason I felt really good, I ended up at a 25, I'm totally fine. It's going to be the same stimulus.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's fives on like so many isolation based lifts. I think the limiting factor often becomes like stability, joining connective tissue. It doesn't feel productive in the target muscle itself. So I'm completely with you, especially on that behind the back lateral raise, like the stability component of that. And then, yeah, it ends up feeling pretty janky. I literally did them today. And my first set, I think, was like 23 reps and then steadily dropped off from there. But if I even try and do like, if they start dropping down to 10 or if they start around 10, 12, it's just like, just doesn't feel that great. So it's nice having that leeway. It's a tool in the toolbox. That's how I view it. And it's a wide range, which is really nice. Do you think there's anything to high reps outside of the practical reasons to go there? Do you think there could be any, I guess, different pathways to hypertrophy that we might be elucidating? Obviously, often people get a bit more of a pump through that. Do you think there's anything to cell swelling, that sort of thing going on for you personally?
Yeah, I think it's possible, and it's something that I sort of posited in the video I made on this, where it's like we don't know a lot of these things, and it's really hard to study, especially what would probably be pretty small changes within the 8 to 12 week time frame that we're typically looking at things. So from a practical standpoint, because it feels good, and a covering your bases standpoint where it might be slightly different mechanisms, I'm not going to take that completely off the table, especially when there's kind of a different mind muscle sensation with certain rep ranges on certain exercises where it's just like I'm not sure if I'm deluding myself, but it just feels like it's so much more disrupting and there's a better pump and so on for certain exercises where I'm not going to, since there's no downside and this is an applied field, I'm always going to choose the thing that allows me to be like, all right, I check these boxes. And even if I'm wrong, there's no downside. So I feel like a lot of the people that get dogmatic about these things, it ends up being we have a whole bunch of tools that are a maybe that you're taking off the table even though there's no floor there. Like you're not going to go through the floor. They're going to give you very similar outcomes. So yeah, I'm not a fan of taking tools off the table if they could have upside and no downside.
Yeah, it's like for your protein intake, chicken works, but there's no reason to not have cod, turkey, like egg whites. Like you can have these other things. They might provide better results for some people, even just down to preference. So, and I'm with you in terms of the mind muscle connection. I've definitely found that for me personally, and having spoken to so many coaches on this podcast, it's something that's come up often actually, where they like those higher rep ranges for someone who struggles to feel a certain muscle. It's like, hey, go lighter, you can get a bit of a better mind muscle connection. It's not the be all or end all, but it's not a, like you said, there's no downside to doing that so long as you're ticking the boxes in the general principles of the biggest one being, hey, make sure you're training hard enough. That's the one that I'd be kind of concerned about given what we've mentioned before. Now, if that's good for rep range, higher rep ranges, how are you feeling then? Let's go into like the 5 and below, or below 5, I guess. That would be interesting to hear about.
Yeah, so there's about 3 studies on this topic. So the kind of same deal in terms of we don't have a whole lot of evidence, and maybe rightfully so, just because if you're trying to cover as many practical topics in your, tenure as a professor, maybe you don't really care necessarily to explore things that won't be useful to an individual outside of, some niche context. So I'm not necessarily faulting the myself or other hypertrophy researchers for not necessarily exhausting this problem, but we do have some data. So we have Weiss, I believe, and colleagues who did a squat in 3 different rep ranges. So it was 3 to 5, 13 to 15, and 23 to 25. And there was a lot of variability in the data, but pretty similar outcomes for all of the uh, quad musculature. And then we have the most seminal study, which showed that it was a bunch of exercises, and it showed that for the quad, there was a benefit or there was a downside to going below 5. Yeah, I believe they compared 2 to 4 and 8 to 12 or some sort of moderate rep range. And then there might have been a higher rep range group, but the 2 to 4 group was definitely there. And the thing that people forget about that study is that there were other muscle groups measured, the bicep and the tricep. The quad did have a difference. So there was less growth in the quad in the 2 to 4 rep range compared to the more moderate rep range. But for the bicep and tricep, there was no difference. So I think that study, the Schoenfeld study, is held up as, oh, make sure to go above 5 reps. And that's probably the strongest evidence to say go above 5 reps. But 2 of the 3 muscle groups in that study seem to show no difference. So that's one thing to point out. And then there was a third study, which similar thing. It was, I think it was biceps as well, also found that you could be within, I think the average rep, it was 3 to 5 reps. So 5 was included, but the average reps ended up being somewhere around 4. And they got the same muscle group and the same muscle growth in the biceps. So basically, we have 3 studies, 2 that said
yeah, you could probably go under 5 and not worry, even though it's super close to 5. So some of those sets were definitely at 5. And then one study, the Schoenfeld study, which was squarely under 5 because it was 2 to 4, and 2 of 3 muscle groups ended up same muscle growth. One muscle group, being the quad, ended up with less muscle growth underneath 5. So definitely not strong evidence in either direction. A signal for maybe there's not enough time under tension for that bottom rep range. But if we're being honest, it probably even leans toward if you're at 4, you're probably not going to worry too much. But as we were speaking about, just from a practical standpoint, there's a decent amount of downsides to trying to go heavy all the time. One, the level of focus that you need, especially on certain exercises, to just execute them and not worry about like shaking and even the slight risk of injury. Then you have the fact that certain exercises, like we were talking about, just don't lend themselves to that lower rep range. Warming up for those, like often I'll do some sort of ancillary exercise. So I'll do like, let's say a calf to start off the session just to get physically warmed up. And then when I go into the compound, if it's anywhere from 8 to 12, let's say a bench, then I'll do like one warm up set and then jump into it. But if I was doing threes, I probably would do a lot more prolonged of a warm up just from a, joint lubrication standpoint. Where if you're doing anywhere from sort of, 8 to 15, you kind of get the warm up early in the set and then you're good to go from then on. So I don't recommend people ever program things under 5, but along the same lines of that high rep range, do I worry about people doing under 5? Do I have to do an extra set if I ended up at 4 or 3? I would say it's safe to say probably not.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it's good to hear though. I think for the listeners, because like you said, 2 out of 3 kind of pointed to the fact that it's not like below 5 is completely terrible and you're not going to grow. But like you said, there's lots of practical considerations here. It's similar to above like 30 or even above 20. Like practically, it makes less sense. It's not like a hard cutoff. It's just that for a variety of reasons, like you said, also like the warm up. But I think there was also a study that was done by Brad a long time ago where it's always looked as like the power lifters versus the bodybuilders, and they matched like volume, I think, in terms of sets. But the bodybuilders were like, they grew, I think, similarly, but the bodybuilders were like, this is easy, I can keep going. Whereas the powerlifters, or the powerlifting kind of style of training, were like beat up quite considerably. So there's like the stimulus to fatigue trade-off of sub 5 reps just doesn't seem to make sense. Whereas I guess, would it be called the stimulus to time
Yeah.
ratio for above like 20 just probably doesn't seem to be like warranted particularly.
Yeah, so that study and this I would consider, so I was basically running through the direct evidence where the sets were equated. There are some studies, and it's not only that one that didn't equate sets and then showed a signal toward there being a downside to under 5. So that is probably the strongest evidence for there being a signal for, but there's a few studies that actually have a signal that point in the other direction as well. So I would consider the indirect evidence to be kind of neutral as well. But to your point, neutral to negative, meaning downsides to under 5, to the point where I think it kind of cements the recommendation just a little bit more in terms of, especially from a practical standpoint. But if you look at it with a fine tooth comb, you're like, all right, it cements the recommendation, but it doesn't necessarily discount the fact that a decent amount there's a decent chance that 4s might be okay, if that makes sense. So the study you're referring to, I believe they did the bench press and they equated volume load, so not sets. So they did 3 reps, 7 sets in one group,
Yes.
and then they did 3 by 10 in the other group, and they got the same growth, but the group that was doing threes just reported being just beat up. I think there were more dropouts in that group just by a little bit. So it was pretty clear that they were a lot more messed up. But the reason why I consider direct evidence a little bit more is because when you don't equate for sets, you don't know what could have occurred. So could it have been one of the neutral studies where the set number kind of washed out? I think it is definitely some evidence, because you would assume the higher set number would be more hypertrophic, but I prefer to see equalized set numbers if we're just comparing them head to head. But then have the added fact that they asked about just how their joints were feeling and stuff like that. That also makes me obviously extremely hesitant with people who don't have necessarily a maximal strength goal to program something like a 3 for no good reason, basically.
For sure. Yeah, this is one of those nice instances where the kind of bodybuilders, some people would look at it and be like, the bodybuilders already knew, they were quote unquote right. The 8 to 12 rep range is the hypertrophy rep range. It's like, well, it's probably the most efficient and effective, and there's probably why thousands of bodybuilders in the past moved towards this range. But it's nice to know again, and science does this often, and I come to say this saying way too much, there's many roads to Rome. So if you want to do a bit of power building, like there might be some ways to do that more effectively and efficiently. If you just love some of these high rep stuff, or you want to experiment, you want just a bit of variety, hey, you can throw some spice of some higher rep stuff in there. So I think it's, yeah, just great. You did a good job of basically exploring that and explaining, kind of getting to, I guess, for you, your the range you tend to navigate towards tends to be. That's for you to answer that.
Yeah, 5 to 15 is really
5
where
to 15.
Yeah, so I actually have 3 rep ranges where I'll oscillate around between the 3. So I have 5 to 7, then I have 8 to 12, and then I have 13 to 15. And I'll sort of do what I'll call a double progression. And I have a video coming out on this. I don't really even do a double progression. I stay within the rep range, and then typically I'll do something that looks like a double progression where I'll try to push the reps. But if on that day I'm feeling like a load progression, I don't like stop myself. I'm not super gung-ho about reaching that top of the range. I'll just, whatever, add that 5 on the machine where you have to slot it down and it's always creaky. And so the benefit for me there is that depending on the day, if I'm feeling good and I feel like one of them just lends itself better than the other, I have that leeway where I'm not really worried about, all right, I have to hit this rep number. I could say, all right, this micro plate is going to allow me to push that progression, as opposed to always being set on having to hit that top of the rep range. So yeah, it'll depend on the exercise, of course, but I think it does a few things. One, it allows me a little bit more leeway. But 2, it also, because they're separate rep ranges, if I have the same exercise in the program, it allows me to continue to progress on that exercise from week to week in a more psychologically pleasing fashion. If you have leg extensions from 5 to 8 twice per week, the likelihood that I'm going to beat my numbers from the early day in the week is 0 pretty much. So allowing that different rep range to essentially progress together is what makes me, it doesn't matter from a practical standpoint in terms of if you got a whole bunch of people and studied them and looked at that, would it actually produce different amounts of hypertrophy? Probably not. But for me, being motivated in there, which is, I think, sort of the art of training and coaching, I think it allows me to, I think the data-driven strength guys talk about this, predictability. Like when you have training that's predictable, you're more likely to show up. You're more likely to have better gains. You're not going to get down on yourself. You're not going to switch things up and so on. So I think having that leeway allows for training just to be, 1, more enjoyable, and 2, more predictable.
Do you not see the progress you would like? Are you sick of writing your own programs? Or perhaps you need some accountability in order to stick with a plan? Then it's time to start working with us. We at Revive Stronger offer a truly personalized coaching service. You'll get more than just an email with some macros or random cookie cutter program. With Revive Stronger, you will be the center of our attention. You will receive your own fully individualized training protocol alongside a customized nutritional strategy. We created the coaching around your needs, wants, personal preferences, and your own unique lifestyle. Every single week, we delve into your program in order to make appropriate adjustments so that we get the most out of your time and the best possible outcome. We help both female and male athletes to seriously change their body composition by adding more muscle mass and decreasing fat tissue. Additionally, you get access to our exclusive Revive Stronger member site, where you'll be able to watch over hundreds of hours worth of educational content. No matter if you're a competitive bodybuilder or just want to look better, if you need help with your progress and taking your physique to the next level, our coaching is for you. It's time to make a change. Sign up today and let's revive stronger.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. It's if I have the same exercise within a program, it's very rare that I'd keep it the same rep range if I'm going to do that, or I might add a pause in there, or maybe the exercise order would be different. I'm not going to give it like the start of the session exactly the same, because it's just like you said, it's just for most people it just doesn't suit them that well. And I think I think there might be some, I guess you could use some of the evidence on daily undulating periodization, where they've seen benefits of kind of having undulations and reps through the week, where there's just a bit of a better like stimulus to recovery and adaptation effects from having some variety in there for whatever reason. I don't know, you beat up the muscle a little bit differently. Like you start a bit heavier, go a bit lighter.
Yeah, or even like from a joint standpoint, just slightly different mechanics. The acceleration is going to be different early on in the set and so on. So the execution ends up being slightly different between, rep ranges. So maybe even that slight difference is what sort of allows for you to grease a different groove, for
Yes.
lack of a better term. But one thing that you mentioned that, this is kind of I find it enjoyable as a topic, but the scientists are just proving what the bodybuilders already knew. One thing that I think we often do is that we take the most reasonable take, which is 8 to 12 rep range. A lot of people were saying it. But if you look at even now and forums from back in the day and stuff like that, there were people swearing by high rep ranges for quads, for example. They're like, oh, you really, really need high rep ranges for certain muscle groups and so on. So I think it's less of like people's opinion, or the lore is less of a monolith than people think. And that's something that I try to harp every single time people say this, like who are these people who agreed that this was the best rep range? Like, I promise you I can give you really, really good examples of people who very confidently think that that's incorrect, and sort of made great gains in a different range. So I think finding out is definitely more useful than just de facto accepting the lore that maybe doesn't even exist. So yeah, it's a pet peeve / not even, it doesn't annoy me, but it is kind of funny for sure.
It's definitely a bit of a pet peeve of mine when they're like, why even do the scientific research? The bodybuilders already knew this. They're ahead of the science. It's like, oh man, for some things, maybe you could say it that way. Other things, not so much. And like you said, like people will say like all the pro bodybuilders, like IFBB pros, train like this. I'm like, do they though? Like, how do you know that? Like, you don't know that. Makes me think of, I won't get too much into it, but like politics. Like you guys just had an election and I was sure it was going to go one way. And because my feed is cultivated with people that are like-minded to me or think a certain way, and then it goes the other way. It's similar to Brexit. Like I was sure it was going to go one way and it didn't. And it's just like, who's your echo chamber? You're only seeing, like, what's the saying? What you see is all there is. It's like, but have you actually looked broader than that? Similar to cherry picking a study, I guess. Like, you actually need to look at the meta-analysis or like the other studies. You can't just base it all off one thing.
Yeah, exactly. We knew this all along is very typically a few people kind of had an inkling, but nobody really knew anything kind of deal. So
yes, absolutely. So another video that you did on your YouTube, to give that shout out, this is where this kind of inspiration came from. And I think you did some great videos over there. So I'll make sure that in the description, at least, we've got your YouTube channel so people can check that out. But one of them was kind of talking about rest times for hypertrophy. And so my question for you is, I think a lot of the listeners will be aware of literature saying that longer rest times tend to lead to more gains. But what about using shorter rest with more sets to achieve similar results? Is that something we can do?
Yeah, I think it's totally reasonable to do. The reason that I tend to push back on shorter rest times for the purpose of saving time is just because I think that you can often save time in other ways, and honestly probably save more time for the same amount of gains if you accept that longer rests are more hypertrophic on a per set basis. Then you can say, okay, why can't I just do antagonistic superset? Or why can't I lean all the way in and do something like a myo rep or a drop set and so on? So basically how I separate these things is that if I lean, and I'll say this, really pointedly, I lean in the direction of longer rest times being more hypertrophic, but is the evidence super strong? Not really. But because I lean in that direction, and I also tend to just lean in the direction of if you can maintain performance as much as you can, it's probably not net negative, right? From set to set. So when you operate from that standpoint, then you're like, okay, how can I save time? Is getting less stimulus per set, but doing more sets going to allow me to save more time? Or is it just while I'm resting one muscle group, I do another exercise and get perhaps the whole stimulus from that exercise? We had that recent Berg study, I think Berg 2024 this year, allowed us to see that it didn't matter and kind of underlined the lore on that, where if it's muscle groups that are either antagonistic or you wait long enough where you just feel psychologically ready for that other muscle group, I would be extremely surprised if there was a downside in terms of hypertrophic stimulus. So while it's an option, especially if you're in a crowded gym that doesn't allow you to do certain supersets that you would have wanted to do, I'm totally fine with people trying to save time with lower rest periods, especially since we know from the literature that if there is a difference, it's probably not as big as one would think. That they're not night and day differences. So it's totally an option. But if we operate from the standpoint that there are gains to be lost, I would just prefer other ways of saving time, even though it is a viable option to get the same stimulus through doing a few extra sets. And honestly, not many. It'd just be a couple. It's not you're not losing the the full stimulus of the next set. It's sort of like maybe, the 10% on top. So just a couple of sets would cover your bases there in terms of allowing you to get the same stimulus. It's not like you need to double or triple it and so on.
Yeah, I think it's short rest periods for me are very much like drop sets or like myo reps, where essentially you're kind of holding on to fatigue so that you can go again and get some of those close to failure reps. But because you're holding on to that fatigue, it's not quite as high a quality of stimulus, so you can't count like every myo rep or every short rest set as equivalent to a high quality like full rest. I mean, I just think about this like, you have many tasks at work. If you are fully fresh and ready for them and you give yourself like that ability to do them to your highest standard, you're going to get a better outcome of task. Whereas if you try and like have less of that, then you're probably going to have to make up for it with quantity. It's like a quality versus quantity, and trying to then see if there's any efficiency we can get. And you're saying, hey, antagonistic is probably like, there's not really a loss here, but we are saving time in terms of quality loss.
Yeah, so that's my thesis on that. It's either antagonistic or non-interfering supersets that I'll lean into if I'm trying to get the most bang for my buck from each set. And then if I want to lean all the way into potentially some different mechanisms, potentially a better pump, potentially just trying to consolidate the stressors during a specific period of training, I'll lean towards something like a myo rep or a drop set where, all right, this is clearly a different stimulus, as opposed to if I were to try to shorten rest to, 45 seconds or a minute instead of my regular 2 minutes. It's sort of like the middle ground where maybe I'm not picking up a different stimulus and I'm also kind of getting a little less hypertrophic stimulus because I haven't allowed the full rest to take place, where I'd rather not be in no man's land, especially when those non interfering supersets exist. If they didn't exist in a weird universe, then maybe it'd be totally cool. But because they do, I'd rather lean all the way in one direction, at least currently how I program. Yeah.
I lean that way as well. As we were talking off air, I think it was off air, I was talking you through my depletion protocol for peak week. And part of that, the training has me resting up to, but no more than 2 minutes. I believe it's 2 minutes. And for like my big compound leg movements, I was like, wow, I don't time my rest periods. I auto-regulate them based off my fatigue and readiness and how I feel, which we'll talk about timing versus not. But yeah, basically my loads / reps had to come down so much. I was like shocked. I couldn't give you a percentage, but it wouldn't surprise me if my load was down 50% to maintain reps. I was just like, I could like that can't be the quality of stimulus is definitely going down. It psychologically doesn't feel nice to be able to do that, and I'm sure it's not as bad on like a bicep or a delt or calf, but for those big compound leg movements, like if I don't get my rest, they go down, they get hit big time.
Yeah, and that's what I was even talking about. Like there are some instances, so you're doing it now during peak week, but there are even other instances where you want to keep a movement in, you want to keep greasing the groove of the movement, but you don't want to go as heavy. You could essentially limit yourself in terms of how much load you're doing by taking short rest periods and sort of just allowing yourself to check that psychological box. All right, I'm not going to remove it, even though my back sort of doesn't feel great when I go heavier on this. So, but I am, getting those reps in. Am I losing a bit of quality? Sure, but probably a very similar stimulus if I just, a couple of extra sets and so on. So I don't take it completely off the table for certain just niche context, but for the vast majority of context, it's not where I'm leaning.
Yeah, exactly. There's a specific reason why it's used during this period of time, like you said, to kind of limit me, and also I guess like just to deplete the muscle as much as possible, those sort of things. But yeah, generally I can't imagine training like that productively, often at least. It just I guess as long as you can program it succinctly and well, but I kind of lean towards the way that you tend to do things. In terms of then that question of timing rest periods, where do you land with that? Because I've spoken to a number of guests about this. I might try and ask more of them because I don't think it's a topic that we have like a obvious definitive answer, at least in my eyes. And some lean towards, yes, standardization. It's important to time them. Others lean towards just let auto-regulation take place. Where do you stand with timing rest periods?
Yeah, so I strongly lean toward letting autoregulation take its course because of one main reason where I've played around with this with myself and with clients, where a lot of the arguments that revolve around standardizing rest is about tracking performance. Typically, they're like, oh, if you don't standardize your rest and you don't know whether you actually got stronger, you could have just waited longer or waited shorter and so on. But I found that day to day, that just fluctuates so much that I'm not sure how much granularity you're getting out of that unless you're making sure that you're resting like over what you need to. I feel like if you're choosing that moderate rest time, which I believe most people do, sort of like, 2 to 3, depending on the exercise, I find that there's just so much fluctuation that you get potentially less stimulus because of the fact that you're forcing yourself to go for it when you just don't feel psychologically and physically ready. And you're potentially not picking up that level of granularity for whether you've actually gotten stronger week to week and so on. So basically, the upside of potentially knowing that you're progressing is not worth it to me compared to just going when I feel ready, because set to set, week to week, just sometimes overshooting and undershooting the RIR. Like we've all been there. We planned the 2, we probably did it 1 or 0 and so on. So it's, to me, just not worth the hassle. One, it kind of sucks in terms of just looking at the clock and having to worry about it, especially if people show up. I work out typically at the research gym where there's people that might talk to you or, things like that. I just don't want to stress over it. It creates more of a stressor, I think, for me than the upside. So I for sure like to just go when I feel ready. And for some people, and I get these comments sometimes and questions, they're like, oh, but people say when you feel mentally and physically ready, but I have no idea what that means. Like, I don't know when I'm ready. One, if that's the case, you probably just need to train for longer and not worry about it too much. But two, just veer on the side of a slight bit more if you are worried about it. Like, they're like, oh, I'm not really sure if I'm ready. I still feel the blood there. Like, you're gonna feel it. It's not an exact science. Don't worry too much about it is one. And two, if you feel like you need a few more seconds, take those seconds. It's really not the end of the world. Yeah.
Yeah, I like the way you put that. It makes me think of a saying, I don't know if I've heard it somewhere else or if I made it up, but it's kind of like forsaking stimulus of muscle growth for standardization. Like I think people like the idea of, oh, everything has to be so standardized, but if it's taking away from your ability to produce a stimulus and actually get the best progression possible, like you said, you're not resting enough because you were resting, don't know, 2 minutes week one, and now you're needing like a bit more than that because you've progressed. Maybe fatigue has accumulated a little bit. Maybe it's just one day where you just feel like you need it a little bit more. Like, that's not a good trade-off. Like, standardization shouldn't forsake for the stimulus of hypertrophy, I think. So yeah, I lean towards, obviously my bias is towards what you're saying here, and I get it. If you are doing short rest periods, maybe I think it probably makes more sense. But if you are leaning towards that, like taking as long, like for the longer rest, for the higher quality sets, like you just kind of want to lean into that. As far as I'm concerned, is there a higher end of rest that people should avoid? Is that been something that's ever been looked into?
Yeah, I don't think that's been looked into directly. I think just from a kind of momentum standpoint in the session, just from, you know, training myself and seeing other people in the gym, not with clients, because obviously with clients you're just spurring them on in terms of I was an in-person trainer for a really long time, so that tends to not be an issue. Although even then, conversation, sometimes you become friends with a lot of clients, and often you can lose the momentum of a session if you really got down the rabbit hole on a topic. So I think not going above 5 is probably a decently good idea, especially if you're just taking the full rest. It's not some sort of superset, but I don't have a strong rule there. There are some times where, you just ended up in a conversation or something like that, where you feel like you've almost lost one, the intensity, two, like you're just not warm anymore and so on, where that's clearly in a territory of you've waited too long. So other than those instances, I don't overly worry about, resting too long.
Yeah, the way I see it is once you've rested enough to feel good and ready, more than that doesn't really seem to benefit a whole lot. So it's not a bit problem until you get like cooled down and I don't know, I'm not in the groove or whatever. So that's where I lean with it as well. And something you had actually in the video that I thought would be cool was you had the peel method, so PEEL, as a way of auto-regulating rest times. I'd love you to kind of overview that.
So I don't think, was that a way to auto-regulate rest times? I think that was just my way
rest period management. Okay, sorry, go for it. I might have had it wrong in my notes.
That's just kind of how I conceptualize evidence and science for a practical field. So there's principles, evidence, experience, and logic is are my pillars for how I try to sort of conceptualize a lot of the hypertrophy topics, and even just generally, like a lot of my goal is to sort of use hypertrophy, which is a popular science, and get people to just understand the scientific method a little bit more, understand limitations of certain sciences, understand sort of how to apply logic to an applied field. And so, because I think this spans in other ways to nutrition, to health, to just how we make decisions in life. Even like often we're making decisions based on extremely limited evidence, how little we know about so many things. I feel like science has done that for me, where I've become extremely comfortable with not knowing things, and I've gotten better and better at knowing how we know things. So the epistemology of just why and how science works. So applying this, I think, will carry over to other parts of your life, but sort of at a high level, it just kind of explains itself. So principles, it's what are things that are either physiological principles or principles that we can take from other fields, things that are sort of de facto true in our physiology. So some examples of that are just the push-pull relationship of a lot of things. So understanding that as intensity goes up, the amount of work you can do likely has to go down to some extent. Obviously, there's some adaptations that can happen that allow you to push both because you just allow that stress bucket to get a little bit bigger. But at a high level, just knowing that tons of these things have push-pull relationships is super useful. Understanding that there's probably a point of diminishing returns. Tons of things in physiology have a point of diminishing returns where how steep that point of diminishing returns is really what we're trying to figure out from a research standpoint. But knowing that it exists is just like a principle that's going to be applied to almost everything within the realm of adaptation and physiology. So that's one bucket, principles, and there's tons of other ones that you can sort of apply across training where you're not going to be dogmatic about things if you just understand that, all right, this person might be just training on that flat part of the diminishing returns based on the available evidence we have, and they're not sacrificing too much, and if anything, they're checking their boxes and so on. While if you really believed that there was a steep U-shaped curve, you'd have a much different perspective on people's training, and you might be led astray in worrying about getting to that range. So it's sort of like taking a principle saying, all right, we have a principle called diminishing returns. We don't know what that curve looks like in individuals because we don't have the evidence. Now let's overlay the evidence we have and say, okay, the evidence seems to be pointing toward, regardless of whether you have a good understanding of statistics and whatnot, it seems to be pointing toward the fact that it's not super easy to get to that lose muscle overtraining standpoint where if I'm going to say that I'm checking all of my boxes, I at least want to consider playing on the higher end of things, seeing how it feels, is my performance doing well, and so on. And while I'm doing that, I'm not going to be overly worried about losing gains because I've overlaid the principle and the evidence. So those kind of go hand in hand to allow me to say, where am I going to hedge my bets? We don't know anything with certainty with an individual until we try it out and see what happens over a long period of time. But we have to hedge in a certain direction, and having sort of a principled, coupled with evidence approach, taking experience, you can't discount the fact that with some individuals, you try them on high volume programs. I had one client who was running super high volume programs for a couple of years, and he kept running them even though he was legitimately losing sleep. He was like, I can't sleep well. I have a restless leg. I'm like, bro, lower your freaking volume and stop being a maniac. Like, there's just clearly, I could have been outside it. Like, I don't even know for that individual whether, and this is where it sort of comes down to understanding evidence. I don't even know if for that individual high volume or lower volume is better because it could have been sleep, it could have been nutrition, it could have been a whole bunch of other things. But even before I try to modulate those things, get the person out of the red zone, right? So the beauty of having a framework is just that you can more confidently guide people to what makes sense, but experience is going to lead the way where if the person's clearly not progressing, the person's not sleeping well and so on, and you just see certain exercises causing pain, so you just allow those last two pillars, logic and experience, to course correct the rest of what's going on. So good starting point with the evidence, allowing those physiological and other principles to add the guardrails there and know whether we can push or whether sort of pulling back is a good idea. And then, okay, what is the person actually experiencing? What have I experienced with other clients in terms of trying these things? What have I experienced with myself? And what is the person actually presenting in front of you? If that exercise is clearly uncomfortable, if they knowing that there's a lot of roads that lead to Rome allows you to essentially to choose the right tool for the job. So kind of the overarching way I try to think about things.
I love that, and I definitely think it does apply to other things outside of like hypertrophy science. It's definitely made me a better thinker outside of just like my career. But it's like when I see, I don't know, my girlfriend will show me an article on X, Y, or Z, and I'm like, I don't know, I'm always skeptical towards it. I'm like, I want to do a bit of research. Like, I'm not going to say I agree, disagree. I don't know enough. Like you said, you got more comfortable saying you don't know. But yeah, what you described there almost sounds like evidence-based practice in many ways. Like start with the science and then take in observation, take in your own personal experience and navigate then what you're seeing, assess, make changes appropriately to the what you're seeing in front of you. And I think that's what a lot of people struggle with. And that's why good coaches really can help someone, because they can do what you've just said. It's not enough to know the principles and like the textbook kind of information. You then want to be able to apply it to an individual and then modify it to get the right results, which is why I think some people, they get a bit lost and confused because it's like, oh no, but science is giving me the answer. It's this. It's like, nah, it's actually not doing that. It's just giving you, like you said, like an outline. And so, yeah, with the volume, it always makes me think of someone look at Eric Helms and look at the volume he's currently doing, which is pretty damn high. And they might be like, oh, like that's the way to go. But then they look at Jeff Alberts, another natural bodybuilding pro, and his volume is, I don't know, a third. And they're like, oh, that's the way I should go. It's like, well, for them, that's the way to go. For you, it might be somewhere in the middle. We don't know. So brilliantly explained. And I think we're coming to an hour now. So I think I'll call it on those two topics. And I have to bring you back on another time, Dan, because it's always great chatting to you and diving into these subjects. And you said you've got another video coming out soon. What was that on again?
Yeah, so the one coming out probably this weekend is progressive overload. So just similar to what we talked about with rep ranges, but just a lot of my topics are really to try to get people to understand what something is. So like the first 4 videos probably super boring to a lot of people, but what is a volume? What is a set? Like why? Because people get confused. They're like, oh, high volume, but what about rep? Doesn't that change volume load? They don't really have even a good understanding of what volume even is and why we've landed on sets and what the limitations of using sets as a volume quantifier is. So I try as much as I can while being somewhat entertaining, hopefully, to try to bring home a concept. So the next one will be essentially progressive overload and why you should consider that to be a physiological stimulus, not the actual load on the bar or the reps that you do. That's an indicator, not progressive overload. So yeah, that'll be the next one.
Amazing. That will be out by the time this is out, because I'm ahead with the recordings and this will be out at a later date. So that'll be amazing. People can go and head over to your YouTube to check that one out, which I said will be in the description. You also post on Instagram regularly, so I'll make sure your Instagram is linked below as well. Have you got anything else going on that you want to let the listeners know about?
No, those are the 2 main places from a social media standpoint. Yeah, YouTube and Instagram.
Same with me. I can't spread myself too thinly because it just becomes too much. Threads, I kind of call that part of Instagram. Are you over on Threads yet?
I am on Threads, and I kind of, for a little bit, was doing what you did, where a thought pops into my head, and then I just put it out there. So maybe I'll start doing that again, because I have a lot of those. Yes. So I'll sort of treat it like a little internal diary where I can go back to it and maybe create a piece of content from just sort of a brain vomit type deal.
Yeah, that's exactly what I do. I just dump my thoughts, and then anything that looks like it got some attention, I'm like, oh, I can make that into some content. But by the way, I just wanted to touch on the videos you're doing. I think they're great because I think they are, like you said, there's some of the principles that you're covering, like big cornerstones. And like you said, they can be seen as boring, but I think many people think they understand these things, but they don't understand it to the level that maybe is, well, that you describe it in, and that would give them a better understanding to really how to apply it, especially for themselves. And coming back to, you said like exploring like how you responding to things, I think it would give them a better way of understanding that and how to do that for themselves. So especially for any coaches or people who are self-coached, I think those videos are going to be extra helpful for them. So again, thank you, Dan, for coming on, spending your time with me. And guys, enjoy. We'll catch you next time.
Thanks a lot.
Losing weight fast while maintaining muscle mass. Sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? It isn't though. It's reality and we know how to do it. And we will help you achieve this. The Minicut movement is an 8-week fat loss program to make you lose a huge chunk of fat while maintaining muscle mass at the same time. We will support you from the beginning to the end so that you see the results you would like to and come out of it much stronger. You'll receive a fully automated spreadsheet that is based on your nutritional needs. You can choose between 6 different male and female training templates. Over 30 videos will guide you through each and every single step of the Minicut so that you're getting the most out of your journey and that you always know what to do. But the best thing is that you can start whenever you want. The Minicut movement is open 24/7. So if you want to learn more or you're ready to sign up, hit the link in the description below. So let's revive stronger together.